And like you said, this is interesting because you don't really expect to get a virus on a computer when you're at the hospital, maybe another person when you're at the hospital, but not from a computer. This one seems to have quoted from the antivirus.
Huh. Interesting. Yeah, I think about this sort of problem a lot, where you've got two different needs that are competing. You've got the needs of the person on the operating table who has a life to be prepared, and then you've also got the needs of IT, which clearly are not as important, but you know, if things are scheduled to automatically happen, they will interfere with each other.
And it's a little bit of a challenge too, because you know, you think about the hospital setting and probably, is there really a good time to do the AV scan? Because it's probably a 24/7 type operation.
Good point.
Things like that. And then you might think, well, do they really need to be doing the AV scans all the time if it's not connected or stuff like that? But like I said, it probably depends on the hospital and on the network and exactly what is connected. And probably the administrators of that network have to like customize how that scan is happening, if it needs to happen, and may be able to turn it down.
If you allow your employees to use their own devices, bring their own devices into the corporate network, what sort of exposure does that expose to you and your company, especially when that device can go to these public Wi-Fi hotspots where they're kind of in a danger zone. Maybe they'll get compromised, or maybe they go to a conference and they hook up to some public Wi-Fi, and now they're compromised and they bring them back into the corporate network and use them. And you probably, as a company, don't have any sort of management capability of that device like you do with a corporate asset. So I know most companies, ours included, has ways, if it's a company device, we can get information, log data and whatnot, and also make sure that the patches and updates and everything are happening on it, where you won't get that with a bring your own device. So it's an interesting article. He talks mostly about the mitigation steps there of what you could do with these types of devices to make sure that at least they have a minimal level of exposure to vulnerabilities. Whether your users in your company are going to do that, it's just, to me, it was more of, let's think about how to approach bring your own device.
Yeah.
And I think we've talked about one of the possibilities, or a smarter approach, as opposed to just bringing your personal laptop in, plug it into the local network at work, and doing whatever on it, having free reign on the network. Maybe you force bring your own device laptops to go to like an hosted virtual desktop or a VM, and that's all they can do. So you have some very constrained network access, maybe just RDP or PC over IP, which is the better version of RDP.
Yeah. I mean, that's certainly a possibility. There are perhaps a number of approaches that could be taken. I think, and I think it's kind of interesting because, near as I can understand, I think BYOD kind of started out as a use your mobile device because, and be able to access corporate assets with a mobile device. But then there was this dilemma, well, what about, usage charges, and, how do you deal with things like that? And so the notion of partitioning to say, you sort of have a work persona and then you have a personal persona, and to be able to keep those separate. And so there are sort of sandbox type tools that reside on mobile devices to be able to support this thing. And I am going somewhere with this. Okay. That whole concept could, I think it kind of extended in, well, let's take the more general laptop scenario, and you could do sort of the same thing. I don't know that there's a way to clearly partition, but perhaps there is. I don't know of any software tools that really do that. I mean, you could argue maybe you have a VM that's specifically for work, that'd be one perhaps way to do it. But I think, kind of thinking how I would approach this personally, that is, if I wanted to bring my own device to work, I would almost embrace, signing off and say, you know what, manage it as a corporate asset effectively. I get to choose what device I'm using. I get to use it for my things as well, but lock it down. Why should I? I don't really want to have to do all that stuff. I'd rather have somebody else do it. I mean, other than for the learning experience, perhaps. But
the easiest way is probably to do a dual boot with dual encrypted partitions.
That'd be another way to do it as well, perhaps.
Because that way it makes it a lot harder for the user to accidentally do something on the corporate side that was supposed to be personal, or vice versa.
That's true. I think one of the flaws that you run, and I think this feeds right into the sort of the dilemma, is I think one of the flaws in that thinking is that we rarely are just at work or just at home. I mean, we're living our lives while we're at work. We're living our work while we're at home. And so there's not really a clear separation between the two. So you need to, at very least, to be able to transition between them very easily, and at best to be able to kind of, in fact, blur the lines and manage that a little bit.
So I kind of equate this to, if I can equate this to something at home, it's our dilemma with IoT devices. So when you're at home and you have an IoT device, you typically don't want that IoT device to sit on the same LAN segment as the rest of your protected components, right? So typically right, exactly. So typically what they say is you should have your IoT devices on a separate network than your, so you should probably be able to do that same thing, that same scenario, and bring it into a corporate environment where you keep things that you don't know about, you think are, you label them unsecure or unknown, and you keep those separated. So things like on, when they come in via VPN, you could, by profile, understanding that this device is not corporate, doesn't, it's not a corporate asset, keep it off on a separate VPN profile, right? And keep it separated from the rest of your corporate network.
Right.
Obviously, you'll have to open certain things up so that they can get to certain things, but keeping it in a separated area, I think, is a smart move.
Absolutely. That's so things can be done with the network access control, not assigning DHCP addresses unless the device is authenticated, recognized, and managed and protected in a proper way. And in fact, that's a similar model that's used in MDM, mobile device management, to make sure that if you're providing access to corporate assets, that there's a mechanism to do that.
I'd like to see more action on the side of ad companies, personally. I'd like to see them either doing more vetting of the backgrounds of the companies that are providing ads to them. I'd like to see them try and limit the content types that they push. If you don't have to push Flash to my browser, please don't. If you don't have to push Silverlight and other things like that, please don't. If there's any way that if you're a provider, you have an agreement with whoever you're taking these ads from, that you host the content yourself and you run a scan on it to make sure there's nothing fishy going on. Because if I tell you I've got my ad, it's here at ad.jpg, or ad.txt, if I wanted to change the content type on the back end, sometimes it's going to still work. It's going to be rendered by the browser as the type that it is, and then we got the same problem again.
We've talked about connected cars and some people who have tried to directly attack cars themselves and the interfaces that they have. This is a little bit different, which I thought was interesting, in that a researcher, Craig Smith, he's actually a part of a couple of different consortium groups that are trying to improve the security around automobiles and electronics within them.
It's white hat activity.
It's white hat activity. But he's moved from having some proof of concept to actually a lot more robust design here. So essentially what we're talking about, though, is it's a car that he has weaponized the car such that when the mechanic plugs into it with their computer, so when you bring it into the mechanic at the shop, they have a computer system that plugs in, and it can infect the computer system through the car. So it's a Trojan car. Just kind of similar to how, we always warn people about, your USB thumb drive. If you find one, don't stick it in your computer because you could infect your computer. So in the same way, if you don't trust the car, not that this would be a normal circumstance, I would think, but it's an interesting kind of attack vector. He also has kind of shown that once he can pivot over to that mechanic's workstation, that actually can interface with a lot of different models of cars. So this is an agnostic type of attack, independent of whatever model the car is, and potentially can pivot and infect new cars as they plug in, and it acts as kind of the host infection vector at that point. And a lot of these mechanics computers can overwrite the firmware on cars, because that's one of the capabilities they have as part of their processes. So it's an interesting attack vector, one that hopefully isn't going to become a real problem, but it's definitely something you want to bring to light, that people should be thinking about and addressing.
So what is the interface that they're using here? Do you know?
I'm not positive. I'm going to guess it's probably related to the ODB2 port, whatever that they have on there, because I think that's mostly how people interface with the automobiles, but I'm not positive. So
right. And I think, you know, my mindset had been, and I think partly because it kind of grew up as a relatively, you know, kind of a mundane interface, and I think it's been becoming more sophisticated over time. That, you know, originally when they started putting control modules in the cars, they had this old protocol where you'd hold the brake and turn the key and then let the brake off and then turn the key again or something, you know, crazy thing. And then the display, the little engine service light would flash a few times, like there's your code. And then you go and figure out what the diagnosis problem. And now they've got, you know, you plug it in and you've got the computers and it tells you all kinds of things about the history and things. And so it hadn't really kind of occurred to me that there might be a way that you could, and I'm assuming some sort of buffer overflow to be able to inject things into the computer and then be able to have it actually attack the diagnostic system, you know, and be able to actually spread malware in that way. So it's good. It's you know, somebody that is doing research and in the light of good is
it's a white
investigating
hat
this.
kind of, you know, trying to say, hey, we should be paying more attention to this.
Can I tell you a personal story?
Absolutely.
This will be great. So last year, I sent 3.5 million phishing emails. And that's how many phishing emails I sent. 3.5 million. And my third book was released last year, and all about phishing. So I'm not saying this to brag, but I think I would call myself like a subject matter expert on phishing. And I clicked on a fish last year. And it was perfect, you know. So I'm preparing for DEF CON. We have 3 major competitions. We're running a whole village out there, and I had all this stuff ordered from Amazon. And, you know, my office is a wreck. Boxes are piled up everywhere, and I get this email that says, one of your recent orders will not be sent due to a declined credit card. And now my rules, you know, open your browser and type it in, don't click on a link, hover. I didn't do any of that. I was stressed and I was rushed, and I clicked the link. And a beautiful-looking Amazon page opens, and I start to type in my credentials. And before I click the enter, I look up at the browser bar, and I see, you know, something.ru, and it wasn't Amazon. Wow. It was a real Russian hacker website. I stop, and I'm like, holy crap! I just clicked on a fish. I just actually I'm the guy who writes these things. I shouldn't be clicking on them. And it was a real humbling moment for me. And I sat there and I said, you know, so many times in this industry we say things like, no patch for human stupidity. I hate that statement because that means if you fall for this, you're stupid. I don't think I'm stupid. And I fell for it. So what does that mean? Well, that fisher got me with the right emotional trigger at the exact right time, and I took action that I shouldn't have taken. And if I had spent 2 seconds, I went back and I looked at that email after I realized I wasn't. I went and, you know, put everything through Wireshark and checked the page and inspected, make sure I didn't get any kind of infection. I went and looked at the email, and it was for like a George Foreman grill and lead press on nails. You know, I mean, I never ordered those 2 things. Well, okay, I never ordered those 2 things together for Vegas, let's say. But, you know, here I had this email, and it was like, you know, I should have read it. And if I read it, I would have been, oh, man, that wasn't me, and I wouldn't have fell for it. But it was fear and stress and anxiety, and all those emotions and feelings kicked in, and bam, I clicked the link and almost gave my credentials over. So it is people often say, I don't want to tell anyone that I clicked the fish because it's embarrassing that I was so stupid. Well, you know, yeah, is it embarrassing? Yeah. Am I proud of the fact that I clicked? No, I'm not. But the fact is, if a guy who sent 3.5 million phishing emails and wrote a book on phishing can click on a fish, I think anybody can click on a fish. So it's better to report it than it is to try to hide it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry for that rant, but
no, that was a great personal story. I mean, I guess the moral of the story, like you said, is even the most seasoned expert in the field can be, you know, tricked if the right circumstances arise. So I guess the right answer is never get stressed, right? You have to take it slow.
Sort of a pop quiz here. For anybody that might be interested in running a honeypot, you know, you alluded to, or you discussed, you know, the fact that they were doing these guessing activities and they got into this thing and they tried to do downloads and they might try to do denial of service attacks. What are the kinds of controls that are recommended to put in place if somebody were to do this to make sure that they're not becoming a part of the problem?
Yeah, well, any place that I've got a honeypot set up, I have a variant of the Honeywall that the HoneyNet project used to maintain, although that hasn't been maintained for some time now. But essentially, I limit the amount of outbound traffic so that we don't become part of the problem. Using Snort inline, I can, in some cases, as long as it's not encrypted, defang their exploit attempts going outbound. The honeypot environment, when they successfully get in, it looks like a Linux system, but if you poke around in it too much, you'll discover that there's only a handful of things that you can really do. You can download tools, because I'm going to let them download their tools so that I can see them, but there isn't a whole lot that you can do outbound beyond a wget or a curl kind of thing. Those are some of the basic controls that I put on the honeypots that I've got.
Okay.
If I'm running a WordPress honeypot or something like that, basically I'm only going to let in the exploit attempts to try to capture the attempts and maybe let them try to download additional tools, but beyond that I'm not going to let them execute anything else, that kind of thing.
All right. I guess the one other thing I was going to offer is to make sure it's isolated from any enterprise assets so that if there's any possibility of something going wrong, you've got a safety valve there.
Right. Yeah. If anybody actually were to manage to break out of the limited environment into the host OS on the honeypots that I run, they're not going to be able to jump back into our enterprise. They're all firewalled off.
The thing that I always laugh about is I have this date that I'm going to retire, and that has to be before January 19th, 2038. And because that is when epic time runs out. So in the old Unix days, we had a signed integer, which was 32 bits long, and it runs out a number of digits on January 19th of 2038. And so if you have an older system that has not been updated to change that to 64 bits, time ends on that date. So that's the last day that I know I have to retire before that date. Because there's a lot of systems out there that are not going to have updated to 64-bit time.
Yeah, so what you're telling us is January 19th, 2038 is the new Y2K. Is that what you're...
Yes.
You remember the Y2K thing, John?
Yeah. And when I had Unix systems, I didn't really care too much about Y2K because it didn't bother me, right? And I was working Unix admin in 2000, and I didn't care because my systems ran great, but I know a lot of the other systems had problems. But this is it. This is the dead. This is the drop dead date. If you've not updated to newer operating system, newer kernel, this is it.
All right. Well, it's like you said, most have been updated, and hopefully that'll be the case as we go forward. I remember, the Y2K thing was a big concern. A lot of work went into it, and it turned out to not be that big a deal after all, perhaps because a lot of work went into it. So I think some of the effort had already been put into correcting this problem. Hopefully it'll be a non-issue by the time 2038 rolls around. Actually, I feel pretty safe myself because I have an old computer and it would take it weeks to do this. But nevertheless, I think some of us have more modern computers, and so let's take a little bit of a look at how we should be protecting ourselves. The first one, obviously you want to have a good backup of your data. But consider the layers of security that you want to have just to prevent getting the malware in the first place. I think, Colin, and a lot of these are basically sent through some email path. And so you want to have a good email filtering solution in place to be able to hopefully not let those into your enterprise in the first place. Or, if you're using an email service as a consumer, same kind of thing. Make sure you're using a service where you're not getting a lot of garbage mail. That's a pretty good indication. If you're getting a lot of garbage email, then the bad stuff's more likely to leak through as well. But then, as a user, just looking at your email. If it doesn't look right, don't open it.
Right? Good user education.
Yeah, good user
practices
education
within your company,
practices, right?
and let people know what to look
So,
for.
so a reminder, we've had Murray on the program here, our little mascot associated with our own internal awareness program. He can help with these kinds of things. I think there are a few samples of Murray's videos on the internet available for folks to take a look at. And then next one would be, you want to make sure your antivirus is up to date on the computer itself. So if it doesn't get infected, hopefully the antivirus solution is up to date on being able to protect against that. Now, generally, the next layer, the fifth, that us as analysts tend to look for is that command and control activity. So this is a case where that may not be available to us. So we're going to need to look for other ways to be able to pick up on this type of activity. But at least you have the first 4 layers that we described, and not to mention actually having a decent backup. So basically 5 layers of protection here.
A common misconception I find in the corporate environments is that people always assume that phishers, when they're malicious, are going to go for something really deep and dark, like we want your credit card or we want your usernames and passwords. But there's multiple layers of phishing. Like phishing could be used just for OSINT, or open source intelligence gathering. They can maybe just try to get one piece of data out of this phish. And maybe that piece of data is just that this is a live email and you'll reply to it. And then they use that email to now search the web and find out where you've used that on forums, what social media you have with that email address. And they'll scrape information on you and use that information to develop a more targeted spearfish towards you. So there's multiple layers, right? I would say that to me there's only a couple differentiators with phishing, and you have the spam, which is just those ads that really aren't targeted to you. And it's not malware, it's nothing like that. They just send it out to millions of people or hundreds of thousands of people, and they hope you click the link because they're looking for, bank data or credit card data because you ordered some Viagra from Canada, from a fake website or something to that effect. Those spam emails are one section, but everything else after that, I would put in the phishing category. Everything from a simple 419 scam all the way up to really detailed spear phishing.
Take this study with a grain of salt, right? Because it did seem like a pretty extensive study. They went and they surveyed something like 10,000 hackers across the United States, UK, and Germany. They also the report that was actually produced for this particular piece about how much cybercrime actually pays. They sampled more than like 300 respondents of this survey that they took. But unfortunately, there were some areas that we all know have a lot of this happening that weren't included as part of
Russia.
Like Russia, like Brazil, like China. Weren't part of this, so you have to sort of take the numbers with a little bit of a grain of salt. So, but there were some interesting things that came out of the study. So, it says that the average cyber criminal brings in about $30,000 a year, which is what they're saying about a quarter of the salary of a white hat. So somebody who's in the security profession, a legitimate security profession. So they're saying that's a quarter of the salary. So the other interesting thing was that if a cyber criminal is looking at a target and they spend more than 1 week trying to find some sort of attack vector to get in, that they usually quit. Which was interesting. I'd never seen that type of timeline put forth for how long do I actually spend before I say this is not going to be worth my time anymore. And then the other thing that they said was that it takes attackers 147 hours to plan an attack against a well-secured target, as opposed to spending a little less than half that time, 70 hours, for easier targets. Which again makes sense. But it's interesting that they were coming up with 147 hours. So
See, I kind of think of 2 different actor sets when we think about that. So you got this actor set who's actually working against maybe a target, trying to get into it. But when I think of cybercrime, a lot of the cybercrime is, just malware that they'll deploy on victim machines. So I don't know if that's accounted in here. How much time does it take me to build a piece of malware, then figure out I got to get a list of people to send it to. I got to figure out how I'm going to send it, distribute my malware, get it on target machines, and then start getting credentials back to me so that I can start stealing money from their bank accounts or whatever.
There actually is there's a full paper, a full report. The report is actually called Flipping the Economics of Attacks.
Securing your cloud applications and the environment that you're working in really is up to you. And so this is really providing some tips along those lines. So the first one they point out is that, this is a quote from the article here, don't let the developers run the show. I don't think that's exactly, it's a little insinuative, but really what it comes down to is, creating cloud images ahead of time that the developer organization or that the application developers would use with the basic security practices and configurations in place so that you don't have to be worried about the developers doing those things. So I think that perhaps a better way of describing this is don't depend on the development team that's under pressure to create features and get applications out there to actually be, they may be interested in security and doing it right, but it's not necessarily their priority. So you have to do some things ahead of time or behind the scenes to help them out in doing that. So, and this is very similar to the practices that we've been putting into place in terms of our use of cloud activities as well, so very consistent. And then the second thing they sort of point out is make sure you provide a separation between the test environment, that is set up a cloud infrastructure for test, and a cloud infrastructure for applications. Try to keep those things separate because you don't want a flaw in the development to be able to extend into your production applications. Second one, very straightforward, take away the user accounts. That is, particularly when you're starting to mechanize and automate things, create accounts that are specifically for APIs and give them only the privileges that they need. So we call that the concept of least privilege or separation of duties in a sense that we implement as a part of our policies, good practices in general. And with the opportunities that APIs provide you, it gives you an opportunity to really constrain and actually understand what a particular user should be able to do. It makes the security analyst's challenge much more simple because anything outside that bound should be a strong flag of a problem. The next one here is basically use the tools that are made available to you. A cloud service provider, a good cloud service provider, and by the way, I think these are attributes that you want to look for in a cloud service provider. That is, they may have certificate management functions, encryption tools, hardware security modules, for storing keys, and I think that's kind of an important thing. That is, when you're trying to protect private keys, having hardware that's designed for that really helps to prevent, Heartbleed was a big problem because the OpenSSL library could potentially expose the keys. If your keys are protected in hardware, it helps to prevent you from that kind of a threat. So having a hardware module for doing that, FIPS 140 basically specifies requirements for that type of thing. And then, web application firewalls, you want to be able to put a firewall in front of your thing. We have a big program internally to virtualize security functions around cloud applications. So those are some of the things that you might want to look for. Treat security like software development. That is, security needs to be tested just like the software needs to be tested. And if you find problems with it, treat it like it's a system outage, just like anything else. I know I recall basically using this scenario like a person has had a problem with their computer and they'd say, what am I supposed to do? Well, pretend it caught fire. How would you treat that situation? And it's a similar kind of scenario here. Treat security issues as importantly as a any other type of a system outage or something like that. Don't forget the non-security tools. We've been talking a lot about mass destructive malware. It's one of our fundamental predictions. It's certainly ransomware has been an issue. So make sure you back up the data, either mirrored or keep it offline, those types of things. And then last but not least, you remember the basics. Anything that's exposed to the internet, particularly when you're working in a cloud environment, the tendency will be that you're going to have administrative interfaces that are perhaps exposed to the internet. There are probably controls that you can put in place to say, I'm only going to be coming from this address, so use that firewall to your advantage. But on top of that, use multi-factor authentication to make sure that somebody can't be successfully doing password guessing attacks. Have we ever talked about password guessing attacks on this program?
I don't think we. No,
You know-
of course we have.
I think we have. I think just 2 weeks ago, Jim Clausing went through a big dissertation on and a very interesting one on password guessing activities. So, use unique accounts per user, no root access without first logging in as a normal user, and it basically, as I said earlier, least privileges. So, lots of good suggestions. I've been kind of rambling here, but it was a very short article, very much worth the read. We'll provide the URL, and I recommend that, like I said, if you're going to cloud or doing things in cloud, make sure you have some good cloud-specific practices in place. Many of them are really basic.
Now, CTFs, they're fun for people like us, right? Keeps us sharp analytically. It helps us to keep our offensive skills up to date so we know how to protect against certain things. It's a really good, safe way for people to explore security kind of offensively and defensively together. Competition, I find, is the best way to bring out that talent. I know you feel the same way.
I do feel the same way. I've played a couple of CTFs. I can't say I've done incredibly well, but I've done well enough, and I've certainly learned something every time I did it.
Yes.
So I think the last one I participated in, I know you participated in, was the Sans holiday hack for this past year, which was a very involved one, I think, this year, right? That was
Yes,
the IoT one.
It was very involved, very fun, and I learned so much. The technology is always changing, and the way you have to protect things is always changing. And the way you have to attack things kind of stays the same in principle, right? But the mechanics of certain exploits, they kind of change. So participating in these CTFs is definitely one way to keep your kind of tools sharpened and knowing what's out there, being able to defend against it.
Yeah, well, I certainly hope that people come up with new modules for this game, and hopefully over time you'll get something. I keep thinking of like reverse Metasploit, where instead of coming up with attack tools, you're coming up with not defendable, but vulnerable systems, and you just drop them in and play each game as you can. So
SplashData came out with their list of the top 25 passwords that they saw people using this year. This comes from about 2 million passwords that were leaked in various forums on the internet. And they analyzed those, and basically this list is what not to use for a password. I mean, their top 25, and I talked about this a little last year too when the report for 2014 came out. But their top 2 passwords were the same this year as they were last year. Number 1 was 123456, and number 2 was password. Now, I don't know why anybody in their right mind would ever use those passwords anymore. But those were the top 2 passwords that they found among these 2 million leaked passwords that they saw this year. And most of the passwords on the list are the same bad passwords that people have been using all along. The highest debuting new one this year came in at number 11, and it was welcome. Well, okay, that's not a real hard password to guess either.
Well, it's actually a little contrary to what you would expect a password to be doing.
Yeah, exactly. Now, there were a couple new ones on the list this year that were 10 characters. Okay, good for you for making it a little longer, but it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0, and QWERTYUIOP. Just going right across the top line of the QWERTY keyboard.
Right.
So those are not particularly helpful. There were a couple that returned to the list after being off last year. Those were Princess and Password with a 0 for the O. The guys who did the report wanted to make a big deal out of the new ones at number 23 and 25, Solo and Star Wars. The new Star Wars movie just came out in December. Was a lot of hype about it last year, so there's talk maybe that's why it was. Princess returned to the list after a year off. But come on, people. Pick better passwords. Seriously.
Microsoft, obviously, I think we all know, and we probably talked about it, Microsoft has their own bug bounty program. And their bug bounty program, there was actually somebody from Microsoft that chimed in and they had said, hey, yeah, we, usually these types of things we like to come through our bug bounty, and in particular, this kind of vulnerability presented to us would probably pay out somewhere between $50,000 and $100,000. So, as the writer of the vulnerability, either going to sell it on the dark web or selling it directly to Microsoft, almost.
Unless he could sell it twice.
Well, yeah.
3 different people, right? I don't know.
But wait, if he goes to Microsoft, he'll get a shirt too.
You
You gotta think ahead.
Shirt.
Yeah.
I
I'm
forgot
going to go
the
to
shirt,
Cafe
the
Press
shirt
and make
factor,
my
the
own
shirt
Microsoft
factor.
shirt. Anyway.
Got it. And that was actually one of the key points, was that there is quite a bit of variation between like how much certain people would pay for it. So in the market, what is something like this actually worth?
Yeah, I haven't gone shopping for zero-day bugs lately, so
no.
I don't really know what the average price is. Whether
Well-
it sounds like 90,000 from our discussion here might be a little on the high side.
Well, I mean, you got to factor in the fact that
Possibly.
it apparently works on all Windows versions. That is pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that Microsoft in their bug bounty program is willing to pay out $100K for a full bypass of EMET makes that pretty significant if in fact he really is able to bypass it.
The next story that I'll go ahead and cover this one here. DeRay McKesson is an activist, and basically what had ended up happening to him, he was the victim of an attack. Attackers gained access to his cell phone account. Now, this wasn't an AT&T account, but ultimately what it came down to is his mobile service provider was social engineered, and they were able to gain access to the account. And I think this is one of the fundamental challenges, that as a service provider, it's the balance between providing friendly customer service, I've got a problem with my service, please help me fix it, versus the, basically providing good security. And, unquestionably, the mobile service provider made a mistake here. So let's put that on the table for the moment. Ultimately, what ended up happening is that the attackers were able to gain access to his phone number, and consequently gain access to his SMS messages. Now, he had what we're going to call two-factor authentication set up on apparently a couple of email accounts as well as his Twitter account. Ultimately, what it came down to is they were able to bypass the two-factor authentication and gain access to those accounts. Now, the question is, if you have two-factor authentication, how did this happen? Well, when we think about two-factor authentication, there are actually two things that are generally associated with two-factor authentication: something you have and something you know. Now, in this case, they're really kind of, I guess, using the notion of having access to SMS as one of those factors, and presumably your password being the password for access to the account being the other factor, something you have and something you know. Now, I think the real definition of two-factor really is something you physically have, a physical thing, not access to a particular account. But we'll let that slide for a moment here. Ultimately, what ends up happening in this particular case is, and I can't speak for the email accounts, but I think there are a lot of accounts that do this. I don't want to pick on Twitter in particular, but in this particular case, Twitter allows you to reset your password exclusively using SMS. So you have the option of having the password sent to you by email or having it sent to you by SMS. And Brian Krebs had pointed out some time ago, as a part of his book, Spam Nation, I think it was actually an addendum to the book, where he points out that your crown jewels are effectively access to your email. That is, almost any account you have anywhere, if somebody gets access to your email, they can get a password reset and have it sent through email. Well, this is a case where you get the choice between SMS or email. In this case, they got access to SMS, were able to reset his password, gain access to the Twitter account, and post, effectively, I guess, some abusive messages. I didn't actually see the messages. But ultimately, what it comes down to is, I think, yes, the mobile service provider made a mistake here. It's very difficult to balance when somebody comes in and says, I need help with my service. But this is a case where two-factor authentication is being misrepresented. It is not two-factor authentication unless you have to have both things in order to gain access to the account. So, and this is just a snapshot of what the Twitter reset is. You have the radio button to choose between a text code that is SMS or an email link having a link sent through email to regain access to it. And they even, give you the last 2 digits of the phone number so that you can verify that it's going to go to the phone number that you're expecting. So,
The question I would have is, on your mobile device, you can get like the RSA app for the RSA token. It's a soft, I guess, whatever. And I've never really looked into this myself. Does anybody know is that portable? Like, could you port that to another device, or is it actually physically tied to like the hardware ID of your device, that key?
I don't know for certain. My understanding is that it's actually tied to the device, but ultimately I think it's coming down to the isolation of the app itself is the boundary of security there. So I don't think it's actually proving that you have that mobile device. It's really basically proving that you have that app.
Okay.
But I am not aware of any situations where that's been compromised at this point. But it's it's certainly one of these things that ultimately is going to be put to the test in the long run.
Yeah, and then even if you had a smart device and had something else on there that could access what was happening with the RSA app, it could be shuttling off the numbers as they come out. I don't know.
Yeah.
Just thinking out loud, but it seems like it's very hard unless you have one of those little physical tokens that have no access to anything else that just display a number. That's really the only 100% surefire way, I guess.
The least convenient, but probably the most secure. In fact,
Right.
there was a time ago when, and this was many years ago, probably 15, maybe even 20 years ago, IBM started incorporating hardware into their laptops that basically provided some security features, as an isolated hardware component, but it added cost to the devices, and I think ultimately it wasn't competitive perhaps before its time. I think if somebody were to reintroduce something like that, particularly in a mobile device, that basically to have some hardware in the device that's dedicated to providing an authentication capability, maybe a little segment of the display that's dedicated to that function would potentially pay off, and particularly in high risk environments or high security environments, particularly the financial community where they're concerned about those types of things, very sensitive about their devices they purchase and that type of thing. So, we'll have to see as time goes on whether this type of thing it develops a lot better. And I know, there's work that's being done to help tie the actual registration process. The SIM card is very difficult to clone. You actually at least have to gain physical access to it at the very least. So that's a case where there's some good possibility in improving the verifying that you have, that you physically have something.
I think some of the recommendations, people have to understand before we detect this is you still, of course, never get it from anything but approved app stores. A lot of this stuff comes from what they call knockoffs. So like if somebody comes up with some brand new, state-of-the-art game or somebody everybody's playing, you go look for a free version of it. You avoid those knockoffs. Rooting the device, and then just generally be aware what's on the device. Kind of keep an eye out for, unusual behavior, or if it asks for additional permissions that you say, well, why did I just download this game? Why is it needing access to my phone? Those are things just, it's the stuff we talk about, I think, every week.
Chris, I guess one final question. If you're training, your employees or people in your organization about the 1 or 2 things to look out for with respect to social engineering, what would you recommend that they should be looking out for?
Wow, I'm limited to 2. I would have to say probably first and foremost is phishing emails, and more targeted phishing emails, right? So this would be number 1. It's just that we're still seeing lots of general phish, but we are seeing a lot more targeted phishing emails coming to people because of how much social media is being used by everyone. Right. They're on every social media platform known to man, and attackers are quickly learning how to get that data. And with the breaches from healthcare and Target and all these other big companies, guaranteed your name's out there somewhere in some black market sales event. And that is being used to scrape data on you, and they're developing mass amounts of spear phishing emails. So that's number 1. And number 2, I would say, is vishing. You asked about that before. We didn't get a chance to talk a lot about that, but that is a huge vector right now. Spoofing servers, and that kind of tech that is used for phishing is so cheap, it's so easy to set up, that phishing is being used from all over the world. Every country that's going through bankruptcy or problems, we're seeing a mass increase in phishing. When we had economic problems, downfall here in the States, we saw a massive increase in phishing. We're seeing it on a corporate level. We're seeing it in multi-stage social engineering attacks. Well, they'll send you a phish and then call you on the phone right after to get you to click malware that's in the email. We're just seeing the phone being used so much more in social engineering attacks. So a lot of times people pick up the phone, they see caller ID, and they automatically trust it. And there is no hover link when it comes to phishing. So we're telling a lot of people, just be aware with the phishing calls. Don't answer questions that don't make sense. If someone calls you and tells you they're Microsoft, they're the IRS, they're the FBI, don't believe it. Don't fall for those things. You need to verify these facts before you give out any personal identifying information.
Yeah, definitely. And with phishing, I think there's still most people kind of think if I'm getting a phone call, there's a lot less likelihood that it's going to be some kind of malicious, person on the other end. Whereas with email, probably 10 of my emails are bad and one's good, So there's definitely, people are trained to know about email a lot more than the phone type of phishing. So I agree. It's one that is definitely on the rise. And people should be wary when they're receiving a phone call. Is this really my bank? Is it really whoever? And if it is, don't give them your info. Call them back instead of trusting that they're who they say they are.
I agree 100%. And because phishing does take the human element, you need a person to make phishing work. It is, like you said, it's not as frequently used as phishing, but it's being used more and more. I mean, just this past few months ago, there was a huge IRS phishing, and they had call centers of dozens and dozens of people in these call centers, just randomly calling people each and every day, telling them that their behind tax from 5 years ago is going to lead to an arrest warrant, and getting people to either give credit cards or Western Union or PayPal money over. And we're talking about $4,000 to $7,000 per person was the average loss. And this is all over the phone. So, you imagine if you're only getting a 5% close ratio, but you're doing thousands of calls a day, it still ends up being hundreds of thousands of dollars a week in loss just from one call center. And they had multiple call centers set up. Phishing is it's a huge vector right now.